In San Antonio, Texas, one of the best known sites in the city is the Alamo. This is a historic battlefield dating to 1836, and it brings in over 2 million visitors a year. What few of these visitors realize, however, is that this was actually known as Mission San Antonio de Valero and was established in 1718. Although the battlefield history is an important component of the site, it is not the only aspect of the site, and much of the history has been erased from the history books and the narratives that surround this site.
So, the story of the Alamo is not, it does not belong or start in 1836. It starts in the beginning. The native people have been here about 3,000 years. The Alamo started when it was created in 1718. So I think it's important for students to learn the reason why the Indians lived here, then why the mission was here, why the Spanish wanted to create French, Spanish people from being Native Americans. So I think that it should be done by historians that know the history.
The Europeans arrived in Veracruz, Mexico, in 1519. You do not have any Europeans up here prior to some of the first Spanish expeditions in 1691, when San Antonio received its Spanish name. The San Antonio de Valero, which is the Alamo, that mission was founded on the San Pedro Creek initially, not where it is today. Subsequently, it was moved to another place near where La Villita is in San Antonio, and then lastly, it's moved to where the mission is today. Now, Native Americans, of course, from the early 1700s, when they started building the mission, Valero, I'm talking about this site over here at where it is now. The labor used to build this mission was 100% Native American. So the mission objective was to bring in congregate all the natives from the surrounding areas and indoctrinate them into the Catholic religion, into the Spanish cultural traditions. And so initially, the Valero, or the Alamo, it became a working mission, and it was successful for a long time, for some 70 years.
As we evolved as a continued tribal community, it incorporated the Spanish and the Canary Islanders along the way that go back, in my case, 10 generations back, where they started marrying our women. When the Spanish got here in the Canary Islanders, there were so few of them, and there wasn't that many women that came along in those ventures, and so they had to rely on the marriages of our Indian grandmothers. And that's how that evolved, that integration existed. People want to say it was assimilated one way or the other, but it was a dual process where they had to survive and accept many of our customs in order for the survival and for being able to maintain a relationship, a peaceful relationship, to where people were able to work together. And through the very beginning. And so through that process, of course, when they wanted to marry our Indian grandmothers, they had to indoctrinate them to Catholicism, where the women had to turn around and go through the sacraments of the church, the baptismals, the first communions, the solid communion, the confirmation. And ultimately, they became known as gente de razón, or people of reason. That's the starting of the casta system here in Texas. That is going back over 300 years as far as that development here in San Antonio. Many of the Spanish that came from Mexico were not true Spanish. They were more mestizos than anything. They were already admixture because they had been living in Mexico in the south. When I call it south, it's still northern Mexico, but the southern point of Mexico, around Mexico City and beyond, they were integrating already with some of the native people from those. So when they got here, they were already basically mestizos, which was Spanish and Indian. And in some cases, some Spanish did get here, but those are so far and few and in between.
Bartolomé de las Casas was a 16th century priest, also a landowner from Spain, who was also known as the protector of the Indians, the very first protector of the Indians according to the Spanish Church. He instilled a sense of reforms as opposed to the encomiendo system that was being experienced in regions of New Spain, whereby a Spaniard was entrusted with the land and everything on it, including the Native American populations as well. And so they were owned by that Spanish person, so to speak. And unfortunately, many times these Spaniards would launch slave raids of sorts where they would come and capture the females and the children from a particular band that was living on their land, send off the male perhaps as labor in the silver mines or in other forms of servitude. And in the silver mines, the expectancy, life expectancy of somebody working in that toxic environment was about 2 to 4 years. And so they really didn't have much of a chance in life. And what you had then was a female with her child left within the hacienda of the Spaniard, being brought into the Spanish way of life, still having some connection to the life prior, but being brought into a whole other way of living. And perhaps, in some cases, that female may marry with one of the Spaniards in the hacienda, and then have a child then that would join the caste system as a Spaniard, completely removed from the lifestyle and the culture of the mother and the original child and the deceased father. And so it didn't take but perhaps a generation and a half to 2 generations before that family was totally disconnected from the culture they had lived prior, and certainly the children. And so Bartolomé de las Casas sought to reform that, and under his reforms, which were actually embraced by many of the mission environments here along the San Antonio River, including San Antonio de Valero, it was a much more humane treatment that resulted from that system of reforms that de las Casas put in action in New Spain. And so we give a lot of credit to de las Casas because perhaps the missionization process in the San Antonio area would not have been as successful, if you will, as in many other regions in Texas of the time. And so, if not for De las Casas, many of us may not really have the same feeling towards the Alamo, or as we know it as San Antonio de Valero. But fortunately, he was able to instill some messages in the hearts of those who would follow him in the 1700s and the 1800s, and change the way that they handled the Native American populations within the mission environment. Does the history at the Alamo address the role of Native Americans that they played before, during, or after the Battle of 1836? And if so, what do they really discuss about the Native Americans at the Alamo?
So I think the Native American history, the Native American story, kind of stops after the creation of the Alamo. So what that means is that we tell the story of how the Alamo and why the Alamo was created, but after that we just kind of delve into the kind of like the battle for Texas independence, and the Mexican Civil War that was happening at that time.
During the tours, do they ever really discuss Native Americans in any context?
Just as as context as why the Alamo was created, not really anything after that.
Okay. Now, can you tell me a little bit about what you've learned while you've been at AIT about the role of Native peoples at the mission, specifically San Antonio de Valero, better known as the Alamo?
These Native Americans are brought into the missions to kind of learn a way of life that wasn't theirs. They were to become Spanish subjects, and therefore they were taught the Spanish language. They were taught to be converted to Catholicism, and they were taught trades. But mostly they were taught to forget their old way of life and become these new subjects in the Spanish caste system.
And why do you think that this information is not presented as part of the Alamo narrative, the more larger context of the Native American contribution to the Alamo? Why do you think they don't talk about it very much beyond the creation of the Alamo?
Specifically at the Alamo, I think that an event just as equal as the story of the Native Americans happened there in 1836, which was the Battle of the Alamo. I think that event kind of overshadows the creation story and the narrative of the Native Americans.
Mm-hmm. What role has archaeology played in this erasure, and how do you feel that archaeologists could help advocate for correcting this issue?
Well, the history of archaeology here at the San Antonio de Valero, the Alamo, has been quite sketchy. You know, say around the turn of the century and so forth, the archaeology wasn't very, I don't think it was very scientific. And then too, you had probably people like amateur archaeologists handling things. I know that they found several sets of remains at the Alamo when they dug up for something, and I'm sure it was not handled by what we today would consider professional archaeologists. We've come a long way in archaeology from the old days, from more or less a hiddenness and unscientific method to rigorous scientific methods and the here recently, I'm sure that the Alamo or Valero remains were handled correctly, but that has not been the case. So, if we're saying archaeology over a period of time, the archaeology in the old days was not very good, and I don't think it preserved the main some of the main assets that they uncovered.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel that archaeologists, historians, and other scholars could help to advocate for correcting this issue of erasure in the way that we talk about the Alamo as a historic and contemporary space?
So what I think we can do, and just historians and stuff, what they can do is to tell the story equally, and not just place a larger emphasis on the Battle of 1836, because all of this, every piece of that story is just as important as the rest.
If you could recommend one thing for creating a more inclusive history of sites like the Alamo, what would that be?
I guess one of the things that I have learned in this path is that when we started on this journey, it was a place for healing. It was an attempt for healing, not only between our families, but the families of all of those that can contribute to bringing awareness and to be able to give the same type of sense of belonging to our future generations, that somehow we felt like we were treated as outsiders in our own backyard. And so we wanted to bring something positive, not only for them, but for a better understanding to society as a whole. You know, the vision of the Alamo is the vision that that most people remember as the John Wayne version, or Walt Disney, those kind of things that are somewhat lacking, and treating the indigenous people, right? Because those Mexican soldiers were indigenous. They were indigenous. They, you know, being nationalized as a citizen of Mexico does not remove them from their ethnicity. And that importance of what they were doing was something that they believed in. And they were not invaders. They were part of this country. Stephen F. Austin was served in the Mexican Congress as a citizen of Mexico. Jim Bowie was a Mexican citizen. There was many others that were Mexican citizens. That doesn't necessarily give you the perspective of what a Mexican is when you talk about their names like that. But the thing about it is that that type of an understanding is important, so people understand that the United States wasn't built just by white America, and certainly not here in Texas. And our families sacrificed a lot of blood and skin into this process of getting to where we are today. And our contributions are just as valid as those that are up there in Washington for those 13 colonies. As a matter of fact, not based on my own vision, but, you know, Governor Galvez, who led the expedition that came here to San Antonio and took the vaqueros and who were the native people, to, you know, run a cattle drive all the way to Louisiana, and involve themselves into providing the beef and the sufficient food for the colonists to be able to survive the winters, and then fight alongside of them and fight all the way into Florida, never losing a battle, which was acknowledged by George Washington. So much was he impressed by the contributions of Spain and Texas, South Texas, in that way, that Governor Galvez sat at the right side of George Washington during the 1776 parade of Independence Day, or 4th of July.
Wow.
And some of our soldiers. But, you know, you don't see that in our history books.
In virtually every facet of the arts, we contribute continuously. And I think decolonization, the efforts that have been going across the United States, is really providing the landscape for such a broader story, a richer story that can be celebrated. So while there's a lot of pain in the efforts of decolonization, again, there's a lot of joy involved. And I think it's this feeling that those elders whose shoulders I stand on top of, who have worked so hard over the last decades to get this message out. And yes, and us now today who are seeing the fruits of that. You know, it's good for them. They're very old now. They're in their elder years, and I'm so happy that they're able to see that they worked hard for something that's tangible, and that now I can benefit from that, and future generations can benefit from that. And I believe that this is just the beginning of us looking back at history in a way that is more true to the way things actually happened. And I think what we'll see with these decolonization efforts is a lot of closer relations between the different kinds of people that live in this part of the world in Bexar County. There's so many diverse people here. It's a beautiful place of diversity, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is the multiculturalism should be celebrated, and why shouldn't we be part of that? And I think these decolonization efforts give us a way to do that and become part of the story.
Is there anything else you'd like to add to this discussion from your perspective?
You know, I had 20-something years teaching experience in higher education. And there's just something about that light bulb that goes off in the students' mind. You can see it behind their eyes when they realize that the stories that their grandparents told them are true. And there's a sense of pride that is almost bubbling out of them when they see, I have a connection to this country going backward in time that comes before the United States itself. And it's so important that we get this into the textbooks today, because it'll put a sense of pride into our students going forward. Who doesn't want to know the full story of their identity? Who doesn't want to be accepted for what they were 300 years ago? And who doesn't want their grandparents' memory and their great-grandparents' memory to be honored? And so I think that these kinds of efforts that we're doing today are going to be a great deal of benefit to the educational community, the educational experience for people of Native American heritage and of all heritage, because it shows that when you're American, when you decide that you want to be a U.S. citizen and accepted within that scope, it shows that being an American can mean so much more than it did before. And I think that for our students, that's really important. We don't want them to grow up in a country where even when they try so hard within their academic pursuits, that their heritage is still left as a footnote or erased from textbooks. I think it would give them a sense of pride to know that they're still included, and that what they do today will go forward and people will look back at them and say, hey, they did a good job setting the stage for broader education for our higher eds, and even K through 12. I believe this is going to be an ongoing thing as our educational system struggles to grow with this idea of decolonization. But I think it's a good thing, and I believe that it's a pain that we have to go through, a struggle to change the way the textbooks talk about us, and an opportunity for new stories to be told. So I'm very hopeful.